A pretty common theme between all of the card game animes is that the main protagonist tends to have a signature card or a ace monster, and that is such the case for Yu-Gi-Oh! And in today's video, which was suggested by a subscriber, we're going to take a look at the 6 ace monster cards of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Protagonist. Now we're going to be looking at these in a competitive landscape. I'm going to be looking at how much of an impact these cards had on their respective metagames over the years. I do want to mention that I haven't really watched a ton of Yu-Gi-Oh! Anime. I watched the original series when I was a kid. I watched a little bit of GX, but as far as the newer stuff goes, while I have been playing the game competitively, I have kind of outgrown the anime itself. So I'm not really going to mention the anime applications of these cards, and instead I'm going to focus on how good these cards are in actual Yu-Gi-Oh! Or in some cases, how terrible they are. I believe that the best order to go through these ace monster cards is chronologically, starting at the very beginning with Dark Magician. Now Dark Magician is an obviously iconic monster of the game, if not the most well-known monster of all of Yu-Gi-Oh! Right up there with Blue Eyes and Exodia, but how competitive was it over these years? The answer might surprise you if you haven't played the game in a while, but Dark Magician has pretty much always been bad, and sometimes at its best, just an underdog strategy. When it first came out, the problem with Dark Magician is that it was 500 attacks less than Blue Eyes, and without the thick plot armor that Yugi had in the anime, you couldn't really use Dark Magician against those Blue Eyes strategies because they both took the exact same number of tributes to bring out, but Blue Eyes rewarded the player with 500 more attacks. So you're not really going to play a card like Dark Magician back in those days, and if we look at the modern support, which it has gotten, I'm not going to just ignore cards like Eternal Soul, which actually are pretty decent trap cards, albeit they do come with a pretty bad drawback compared to a lot of the Blue Eyes cards, which almost always have just all upside and no downside. So even with all the support that Dark Magician has gotten over the years, it never has been more than a rogue strategy. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that the deck around Dark Magician is bad per se, but compared to decks like Blue Eyes and compared to most rogue strategies, you're just not going to see a successful Dark Magician variant in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! No matter how much support Konami seems to throw at it. So while Dark Magician has been a very iconic monster over this game's history, as far as its competitive impact goes, it's basically had none. The next ace monster card in the history of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is Elemental Hero Neos, and to be completely honest, this is actually my favorite of all the ace monster cards. I thought this guy looked awesome when I was growing up, and even looking back now that I have a couple secret rare copies of this card that they reprinted in a tin, I actually still think this card's artwork stands up. It looks a little silly, but I think he just looks pretty cool. He's kind of like a big superhero. He's got a bunch of cool designs on him, and despite all this, despite the fact that he's my favorite of all the ace monster cards, he is by far the least viable in competitive play. I mean, oh man, is the Neospatian archetype and Neos and all the support surrounding it just so darn bad. I mean, there's actually a pretty well-known video with just over 600,000 views that I'm sure many of you seen talking about how bad the Neos support is, and the fact of the matter is that Neos isn't even good enough to be classified as a rogue strategy or tier 2 or tier 3 or tier 4. It's pretty much only reserved for casual play, and even in that casual play, it's pretty much the bottom of the barrel. Now I do want to clarify that you should look at the date that this video is recorded, because at the moment Konami has started leaking some Neospatian support. I know that the next sneak peek promo is a direct support for Neos, and I also know that it's getting support not only in the Megatins but also in the next legendary decks. So depending on when you watch this video, it might sound pretty stupid that it's really bad, but the fact of the matter is, ever since GX all the way up through the summer of 2018, Neos has pretty much just been the butt of every single joke about bad support for the protagonist, and maybe Konami will fix this archetype. I think we've seen that sneak peek promo. It's not insane, it's definitely a decent card, but I think Konami would really have to print some absolutely crazy cards to actually make Neos playable. But outside of that, Neos has pretty much seen seen no play or experimentation in any competitive manner. Moving past to normal monsters, we go into Stardust Dragon, which was the ace monster card from Yu-Gi-Oh! 5Ds, and man is this thing so darn good. Not only was this thing a huge metagame shifter back when it came out, I mean really 5Ds reigned in synchro monsters with a lot of super strong cards, and Stardust Dragon was absolutely one of those cards, but even up until just a year or two ago, Stardust Dragon was still seeing metagame play, and even nowadays it does tend to see play in a variety of synchro decks, and that's not super surprising considering how strong this card is. Level 8 is pretty much the best level to have for synchros. It seems like, despite the fact that that's a higher level than like level 6 and level 7, it seems like level 8 is the easiest of all the synchros to actually make. We see a lot of popular synchro monsters be level 8, and Stardust Dragon has good attack stats. It has an amazing effect that negates destruction and brings itself back every turn, and that has led Stardust Dragon to be one of the best ace monster cards in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Now, it does have a lot of support from the anime that eventually made its way into the TCG. Most of that support, like the Majestics and the Assault mode, didn't see that much competitive experimentation, but one support that I do want to mention specifically is Starlight Road. For much of the modern era of Yu-Gi-Oh!, Stardust Dragon saw play mainly in tandem with Starlight Road because Starlight Road was such an excellent counter to cards like Heavy Storm. Back when Heavy Storm and other mass pieces of removal were legal, a lot of people played Starlight Road as a 1-of or a 2-of in their heavy back row strategies, and a lot of times that free Stardust Dragon summon after negating your opponent's Heavy Storm was way too much for you to deal with. It was just way too much value off of one single trap card, and yeah, once you summoned Stardust Dragon off of Starlight Road and you tributed it to negate a destruction effect, it didn't come back because it wasn't properly summoned, but that 2 negates for one card was really good back in the day. But Stardust Dragon will probably be a competitive monster for pretty much all of Yu-Gi-Oh! I'd be pretty surprised if this card ever got fully power crept out of the game, because it seems like Konami has not printed another level 8 synchro monster that negates so many different destruction effects in the same way that Stardust Dragon does. I mean, we have Stardust Spark Dragon, which does a similar thing, but I still say that Stardust Dragon is a better version of that card, and that pretty much leads to it seeing more competitive play than almost all of the other level 8 synchro monsters that have anti-destruction effects. Of all the cards on this list, number 39 Utopia is the hardest to analyze. On one hand, the card absolutely saw play not only when it came out, but also in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! But on the other hand, the only reason this card is seeing play right now is as a means to an end, that end being Utopia the Lightning. So while this card is technically appearing in extra decks even in 2018, the only reason this card is appearing in those extra decks is because people want to summon Utopia the Lightning, and Utopia just happens to be the most convenient way to do that. However, it's not really fair to just completely ignore the fact that Utopia, back when it first came out, was a pretty reasonable rank 4 monster, and even though it eventually did get power crept out of the game about a year after Exceed Summoning was introduced, Utopia did see a lot of high level play, not only as a 1-of in extra decks, but also a 2-of. Rank 4s nowadays are sort of all-purpose monsters. They can deal with monsters, they can deal with back row, they can have a variety of effects, but back in the day, Utopia was pretty much the prime example of what a rank 4 should be. It didn't have an overpowered effect, but it had a useful utility effect packed with some decent stats, and that made Utopia a pretty good rank 4 for a lot of decks. However, nowadays the card doesn't see a lot of play outside of a stepping stone, which means that this really hasn't stood the test of time along the same way that Stardust Dragon has, which is still being played as an actual level 8 synchro monster, not so much a stepping stone into another card. Odd Eye's Pendulum Dragon was very, very hyped when it was first announced, but ended up kind of falling flat. It saw play in some early Cliffort builds as a way to search Cliffort Scout, but pretty much after the second wave of Cliffort support, people just cut it from their list entirely, simply because it was too slow, and also it wasn't a Cliffort monster, which meant that there was some conflictions with your other cards, but the card did see some play later on. I think the best example is when Sky Iris came out. Sky Iris was an incredible search card, and it synergized really well with a lot lot of the pendulum monsters of that time period, and a lot of people were playing Oddeyes Pendulum Dragon as a searchable target for that Sky Iris. And I think what's interesting is that by that point there were so many better search effects than Oddeyes Pendulum Dragon for pendulum cards that a lot of those people were just using the card as rank 7 fodder, and also as a way to just kill their opponent through some pretty crazy boards, simply because Oddeyes Pendulum Dragon has that awesome on-field effect that does double damage. But even nowadays, while it's not the actual physical Oddeyes Pendulum Dragon card, we see a lot of the Oddeyes extra deck monsters, the different forms of the card, seeing competitive play. The most recent example being both Oddeyes Absolute Dragon and Oddeyes Vortex Dragon synergize really well with link summoning. You summon an Oddeyes Absolute Dragon and then you link summon using it to summon a Vortex Dragon from your extra deck, and that's a pretty darn good negation card even in 2018. However, the original Oddeyes Pendulum Dragon has pretty much all but fallen out of the competitive landscape. Even cards like Sky Iris are not good enough to keep the card in competition. We may see a resurgence later on, but for now, Oddeyes Pendulum Dragon is simply not fast enough for competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! In 2018, so people are just kind of stuck using Absolute Dragon and Vortex Dragon instead. I've mentioned before that link monsters weren't really that good when they came out. However, there is one exception to that rule, and that is Firewall Dragon, which is currently the only link monster to appear on the Forbidden and Limited list, which I think is a testament to how strong this card is, especially in comparison to all the other Ace monster cards, because this is the only one of any of these guys that have appeared on that list, which means that it must be pretty darn good, and it is. It's a card that can be used to set up your board, it's a card that can be used to break your opponent's board, it's a card that causes a bunch of infinite loops with its special summoning effect, and this is a card that pretty much breaks link summoning as a mechanic, and I wouldn't be surprised if this card eventually gets banned, because right now a lot of the biggest issues that people have with this current format involves looping Firewall Dragon's effect over and over again, more so than any of these other cards on this list. Even Stardust Dragon, which is probably the second best of all these Ace monsters, it never was overpowering, it never was too broken, its attack stats weren't high enough, it wasn't aggressive enough, but Firewall Dragon is just one of those jack-of-all-trade cards that simply does way too much in one monster card, which will probably eventually lead it to being banned, but for right now it's limited and still a huge headache for a lot of players. Anyway though, that is going to wrap up my discussion on the Ace monster cards of all of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Protagonists in the anime. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this discussion. If you want to see more, please let me know in the comments. I think another interesting thing to do is to take a look at all of the antagonist Ace monster cards, such as Blue Eyes White Dragon and all of those ones. That could be cool as well, but let me know if you want to see that. Anyway, I will see you guys later. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.